There is an extremely popular dive spot off of the Florida Keys where tens of thousands of recreational divers and tourists go every single year. It is extremely safe and an exciting dive site for nearly all of those people. There are rules and procedures that have been put in place to make sure that it stays safe and fun for everyone. However, every once in a while, a diver or group of divers, either knowingly or unknowingly, does not follow these rules. And in these cases, tragedy can be one short misstep away. This video tells two true stories of the Spiegel Grove. The USS Spiegel Grove was a Thomaston-type dock landing ship of the United States Navy. The ship was named after the home and estate of Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th President of the United States, and launched on November 10, 1955. Over the first few years, the ship was deployed with the 6th Fleet touring the East Coast, the Mediterranean, and Africa. The ship supported spaceflight operations, including the May 24, 1962 Mercury Atlas 7 flight, where astronaut Scott Carpenter became the 6th human to fly into space. The ship spent the next few years performing training exercises on the East Coast and Caribbean and performing goodwill tours and major military exercises, including Operation Steel Spike in 1964, the largest peacetime landing exercise in history. The ship evacuated Americans during conflicts in Cyprus in 1974 and from Lebanon in 1976. After a long and illustrious career, the USS Spiegel Grove was decommissioned on October 2, 1989, and was transferred to the James River in Virginia as part of the Atlantic Reserve Fleet, or the Mothball Fleet. Here, the ship was maintained in case it was needed in the future. But that day would never come. In May of 2002, the ship was moved from Virginia to Florida, where it was to be sunk as an artificial reef, which was an event in itself. On May 17th, the 12-ton anchors were dropped and the ballast tanks were flooded. However, while the workers were still on board, several hours before the ship was to be fully submerged, the ship rolled to the starboard side, forcing all workers to abandon ship, leaving their equipment behind. The ship sank upside down and came to rest with the stern resting on the ocean floor and the bow slightly protruding from the ocean surface. In June, the ship was rolled over onto its starboard side, where it would remain in this position until July 10, 2005. Hurricane Dennis arrived in 2005 with 20-foot swells and a maximum recorded wind speed of 121 miles per hour. The hurricane destroyed homes and ravaged crops, but no deaths were recorded as a direct result of the hurricane. The hurricane rolled the giant ship onto its keel, righting the ship as was initially intended. Now the ship sits as the largest artificial reef in Florida and hosts many species of marine life and is a huge tourist attraction. The Spiegel Grove is located 6 miles off of Key Largo in the Florida Keys. It is 510 feet long and 84 feet wide. The top deck is 60 feet below the surface, and the hull is up to 135 feet deep, requiring advanced certification for diving. It is said that one could dive the labyrinth of hallways and rooms 100 times and still not enter every part of the ship. Even with the advanced diving credentials, part of the ship remains recommended as off-limits. And some portals have even been sealed because it is too dangerous for divers to enter these parts of the ship. The upper deck at 60 feet below the surface is considered a safe and enjoyable dive that is completed by tens of thousands of people every year. Even novice divers and snorkelers can get a great view of the ship from above when the conditions are right. However, penetration diving of the wreck, particularly below 90 feet, is considered dangerous as there are many obstacles that a diver could become entangled. Furthermore, diving even further into the maze of hallways and cabins to as much as 135 feet depending on the length of the dive requires stages and technical diving experience. Many local diving establishments run tourist snorkeling and dives above and to the Spiegel Grove wreckage. However, they only allow penetration dives of the wreckage to trained and certified divers. Diving this ship can be a simple dive for beginners and intermediate divers up to advanced for only the most experienced. This is why the Spiegel Grove has become such a popular dive spot since it was scuttled in 2002. On March 16, 2007, 4 experienced and advanced certified divers entered the water above the Spiegel Grove wreckage. The divers were Jonathan Walsweir, Scott Stanley and Howard Spatler of Westfield, New Jersey, and Kevin Coughlin of Chatham Borough, New Jersey. These men were all experienced divers that had performed penetration dives deeper than 100 feet before. They were also good friends that had plenty of diving experience together, so they were very comfortable on this dive. In fact, they dove the Spiegel Grove the day before and had enjoyed the dive so much that they were back to do it again. Because the water was so clear, and they had what they believed was a good understanding of the ship's layout, they believed that they could navigate the many compartments without taking extra safety gear, like guidelines and extra tanks. They did stage tanks near the exit, but only dove with single tanks. Given the single tanks that each of them took with them, if they went to the bottom of the ship at 135 feet, they could only be there for approximately a maximum of 20 minutes before they had to begin their ascent. The divers entered the water and dove the 60 feet to the upper deck. After reaching the upper deck, they entered the ship, and immediately all 4 divers began to descend through the twists and turns of the hallways and inner cabins, getting deeper and deeper into the ship's hull. As they descended through each of the levels of the ship, it got darker and darker until there was no light other than their own torches. At this depth, it was basically pitch black. As long as they were careful and didn't stir up the silt, the water was clear and they could see with their lights. The 4 men navigated the labyrinth to the lower deck, then the pump room at 135 feet. They explored the bottom of the ship until silt was kicked up, obscuring their visibility. Even with their 2 strobe lights, they couldn't see anything. The silt was so thick they couldn't see the walls of the vessel or any upcoming corners or hallways. In the tight passageways, their bubbles would impact the ceiling above, and rusted debris would rain down on top of them, obscuring the view even more. They became disoriented and had no lines to lead them to safety. Given their limited amount of air, they needed to find a way out, and they needed to find it fast. As the 4 divers searched frantically for any path that seemed familiar and would potentially lead to an exit, their air drained. At one point, Howard Spatler thought he recognized an area and may know the way out. He tried to get the others to follow, but they wouldn't. The other divers went the opposite direction. Howard grabbed Scott Stanley's arm and tried to pull him in this direction, but Scott wouldn't go. Scott was the strongest diver and the most experienced and went after the others. With his air running low, Howard swam the direction that he believed was the exit. Howard surfaced at the dive boat and alerted everyone that the others needed help. As a rescue party was organized, 2 divers of a nearby vessel found Kevin Coughlin, who had made it out of the ship but was unconscious. They brought him to the surface to a Coast Guard vessel and performed CPR, but it was no use. They were not able to revive him, and he was later pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. Because of rough seas and fast-moving currents, in order to not risk more lives, the recovery effort was suspended until the next day. The next morning, the recovery team entered the water and made their way to the bowels of the huge ship, where they found the bodies of Jonathan Walsweir and Scott Stanley. They were approximately 130 feet down, about 90 feet from the nearest exit. Although the ship is intentionally cut with holes for divers to enter and exit the ship at various locations to make the dive more enjoyable, these locations are much higher in the ship. The area that Walsweir and Stanley were found was supposed to be off limits and was supposed to be sealed off, but it was not. It remains a mystery as to why this area was not sealed off. Kevin Coughlin had previously been in this area before he escaped. To escape this area, he must have found his way back to where Howard had tried to get them to follow. To get to the nearest exit, Kevin must have navigated 75 feet through a narrow hallway, then up a 45-foot narrow shaft to the opening 90 feet below the surface, only to have his air run out just before he made it out. The autopsies later showed that all 3 men died of drowning. On October 17, 2013, Joseph Dragojevic and James Dormy sat on a commercial charter boat owned by Scuba Doo Dive Company of Key Largo, Florida. They were on the surface 60 feet above the Spiegel Grove, along with 6 other divers listening to their dive captain for this trip, Kimberly Chapman, explaining that there would be no penetration diving and no decompression diving on this trip. However, Joseph and James informed the dive captain that they would be leaving the group and entering the engine room during their dive. Joseph was a veteran Lake County Emergency Medical Services captain near Orlando, and both he and James were experienced in technical diving and diving together. This was their second dive of the Spiegel Grove that day. They had previously performed a penetration dive where everything had gone perfectly well, and they were now double dipping, as they say. The entire group dove down to the wreckage, while the other divers in the group swam around the deck, experiencing the coral and the marine life. Joseph and James entered the interior and began exploring several interior decks. As they explored, they tied their guideline along behind them, so they would have a secure path to lead them back to the open water when their dive was complete. As they explored deeper into the ship, they kicked up silt, reducing visibility, but managed to complete their dive, exploring several levels of the ship without any major obstacles. They each signaled that they were okay and low on air and ready to exit. They began their ascent along the guideline with no issues. James led the way back, following the guideline, while Joseph followed closely behind, reeling in the line. Periodically, James would stop and turn, looking back to make sure that Joseph was behind and in good shape. Joseph would signal with his flashlight that everything was good and they would continue. James continued along the line and turned to check on Joseph, but this time, Joseph wasn't there. The line was tight, so James briefly waited, but nothing. As he pulled the line, there was no give. It felt as if it was caught. James followed the line back to find that it was tangled in some debris, but where he thought he would find Joseph at the end, untangling the line, there was nothing, and the other end was loose, suspended in the water. James searched for Joseph in the dark, murky water, but with his own oxygen running low, he had to get back to the surface. Upon surfacing, he told the dive boat that Joseph was missing inside the ship. They immediately contacted the Coast Guard, and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission were quickly on site conducting a search and recovery mission, but they didn't find anything. Volunteers dove through the night searching for Joseph. The recovery mission continued into the next day when they found the body of Joseph Dragojevic. It was later found that Joseph had suffered from nitrogen narcosis. The divers had mixes of 29% for their main tanks and 45% for their decompression tanks. While Joseph and James were ascending, nitrogen narcosis became an issue for Joseph. This is a narcotic effect of breathing pressurized gas and results in a loss of coordination and judgment. It is believed that this lapse in judgment caused Joseph to leave the guideline, and he became lost. Joseph left behind a daughter and son. His son, who was also a diver, left the following message on a diving message board. Narcosis came into the picture and resulted in choices to deviate from his plan, which ultimately is what did him in, not his lack of gear or personal experience. While I do not blame Jim, if it were myself or another close friend who we all dove together with, we wouldn't have left him out of our sight, and this would have been avoided. Letting yourself get far enough away from your partner to where he goes out of sight simply defeats the purpose of the buddy system. I understand that 100% visual contact inside a ship can be impossible at times, but you should be checking back often enough so you have a general idea when you got separated. But regardless of the validity of the last statement, they had a reel, and if it weren't for Narcosis, he would have continued to follow it out, even if it became jammed or what have you. I am in no way defending nor condoning their actions or behavior, cause in the end it was their dumbass choice to even go into the damn thing. And in the end, no matter how much people argue about how and why, which mistakes were made or not made, he is still and always will be dead. Trust this, in the hopefully far future, when him and I meet again, I'm gonna kick his dumb ass. I mean that with all the respect in the world, Dad. This is True Mysteries. Please like, leave comments, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.